He paid $6 for 3 Apache women, but none of them agreed to belong to him. The man rode slowly along the dusty trail, the late afternoon sun burning down on his shoulders. His horse moved steadily, kicking up small clouds of dust with each step, and the vast plains stretched endlessly around him. He had spent years wandering the frontier, moving from one small town to another, searching for something he could not quite name. Some days he thought it was companionship, a sense of home, or perhaps a feeling of belonging. Other days it seemed he was chasing only an illusion, a dream he had built in his own mind. His name was Samuel, a man in his early 30s, tall and lean, with weathered skin from years under the sun and eyes that had seen more hardship than most could imagine. Samuel had grown up on the outskirts of a small settlement where life was harsh, and the rules were simple: work hard, survive, and make your own way. He had learned early that the world was not kind, and that every person needed to find their place. But despite the lessons of his youth, Samuel carried with him a stubborn hope that something different, something better, awaited him somewhere beyond the horizon. Today, he had a plan, though it was an unusual one. In a small frontier town he had passed through earlier, he had heard whispers of 3 Apache women living nearby. According to the rumors, they were independent, strong, and accustomed to life on their own. To Samuel, who had grown up with a very narrow idea of how relationships should work, this presented a curious opportunity. He thought that perhaps if he could offer something of value, money, goods, or trade, he might be able to convince them to join him. It was a thought that seemed simple in his mind, but he did not yet understand the depth of their independence or the strength of their own will. As he rode, Samuel reflected on his life so far. He had tried to make connections in other towns, to find people who would stay, but those efforts had often ended in disappointment. Families were wary of outsiders, and women who had grown up in the towns knew better than to trust a stranger easily. Samuel had money, yes, and he had the ability to provide for a small household. But what he lacked was understanding, an understanding that relationships could not be bought, and that trust and respect were far more important than any coin or item of trade. The trail led him through rolling hills and patches of dry grass. Occasionally, he glimpsed a distant cluster of trees or the sparkling reflection of a small stream. It was beautiful, almost peaceful, yet Samuel felt a tension in his chest. He was nervous about the encounter to come, but he tried to hide it behind a mask of confidence. He told himself that $6 was a fair offer, a small price for what he believed could be a new beginning. To him, it seemed simple. He would offer the money, make his intentions clear, and surely the women would agree. He did not yet know that the world rarely worked according to his expectations. Hours passed as he rode, and the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, casting a golden glow across the landscape. Samuel spotted smoke rising in the distance, a sign of life among the hills. He felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The closer he got, the more vivid the stories of the women became in his mind. He imagined them as quiet and obedient, perhaps even grateful for his offer. Yet, deep down, a small voice whispered that things might not go as smoothly as he hoped. Finally, he reached a clearing where the 3 women were tending to their tasks. One was drawing water from a nearby stream, another gathering wood for a fire, and the third carefully arranging food in small containers. They moved with confidence and ease, each gesture purposeful, each movement full of grace. Samuel slowed his horse, watching them from a distance. Their presence was striking, not because they were unusual, but because they seemed entirely self-sufficient. They did not glance his way, did not acknowledge the outsider intruding on their space. This independence, while admirable, also made Samuel feel a twinge of unease. He had underestimated their strength. Taking a deep breath, Samuel guided his horse closer. He tried to appear friendly, smiling as he approached. "Good evening," he called, his voice carrying across the clearing. The women looked up, their eyes meeting his, steady and calm. There was no fear, no surprise, just a quiet assessment. Samuel felt a flicker of uncertainty. Their gaze was direct, unwavering, and it reminded him that they were not like the people he had met in other towns. He dismounted slowly, holding the reins in one hand and patting his pockets with the other. I have something for you, he said, reaching for the small pouch of coins he had carried. The women exchanged glances, subtle but noticeable, and continued their work. It was clear they had no immediate interest in him or his offer. Samuel swallowed hard, trying to maintain his composure. He had expected gratitude, maybe curiosity, but not this calm, almost indifferent reception. For the first time, he realized that money alone might not be enough to sway them. $6, he said, holding up the coins, for your company to be with me. He tried to sound confident, but his voice wavered slightly. The women paused, one of them looking directly at the coins, then back at him. Their expressions were unreadable, but their silence spoke volumes. Samuel felt a mixture of frustration and disbelief. How could they not understand what he was offering? How could they refuse something he considered valuable? One of the women finally spoke, her voice soft but firm. "We do not belong to anyone," she said. Her words were simple, yet they carried the weight of truth. Samuel's heart sank. He had never been refused like this before. In his previous encounters, people had hesitated, bargained, or eventually agreed. But here, these women were clear, unwavering, and unyielding. Samuel realized that he was confronting a world far different from the one he had known, a world where money and offers could not replace respect and consent. He took a step back, trying to hide his growing embarrassment. The woman's words echoed in his mind. "We do not belong to anyone." It was a lesson he had never fully understood until now. For all his confidence, his plans, and his assumptions, he had failed to see that each person had their own will, their own choices, and their own dignity. Samuel looked at the women again, seeing them not as objects to acquire but as human beings with their own agency. It was a difficult realization, but a necessary one. The sun continued its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Samuel stood quietly, unsure of what to do next. He could leave feeling defeated, or he could try to learn from this encounter. Slowly, he chose the latter. He lowered the pouch of coins, letting it rest on the ground, and nodded to the women. "I understand," he said, his voice quieter now. It was not a full apology, nor did he yet grasp the full extent of his mistake, but it was a start. Respect, he realized, was not something one could buy, it had to be earned. As he remounted his horse and prepared to leave, Samuel looked back one last time. The women continued their work, serene and independent, a reminder of a lesson he would not soon forget. He rode away from the clearing, the dust swirling around his horse's hooves, carrying with him a mixture of humility and curiosity. The world was larger, more complex, and far more interesting than he had imagined. And for the first time, Samuel felt that perhaps his journey was not only about seeking companionship, but about understanding the people around him, learning from them, and growing as a person. The frontier stretched out endlessly before him, and as the stars began to appear one by one in the darkening sky, Samuel felt a strange sense of peace. He had not gained what he had come for, but he had discovered something far more valuable, a glimpse into the strength, independence, and dignity of people who lived life on their own terms. And in that moment, riding through the quiet night, he realized that every encounter, no matter how difficult or humbling, had the potential to teach him something new about the world, about others, and about himself. The next morning, Samuel woke before the sun, the memory of the previous day lingering in his mind. The encounter with the 3 Apache women had left a deep impression, one that he could not easily shake. As he sat by his small campfire, stirring the embers with a stick, he reflected on what had happened. Their words, simple yet firm, echoed in his mind. We do not belong to anyone. For hours he replayed the scene, trying to understand what he had missed. Samuel had grown up in a world where possessions were tangible, where trade and money could secure agreements, and where people often followed the expectations set before them. But the women had shown him that there was a different reality, one in which respect, choice, and independence mattered more than any offer he could make. This realization both humbled him and sparked a curiosity he could not ignore. Determined to learn more, Samuel decided to observe the women from a distance, hoping to understand their daily lives and perhaps find a way to connect without forcing anything. He moved carefully through the trees and underbrush, keeping his presence subtle, his horse tied to a nearby rock. The clearing where the women lived was alive with activity. One of them was weaving thin strips of leather into what appeared to be a small basket. Another was tending to a small fire, placing stones around it to hold a pot. The third woman was gathering herbs and wild plants, carefully inspecting each before placing it into a bundle. Samuel watched quietly, noting the ease with which they moved and worked. Their coordination was impressive, a silent rhythm that showed both experience and mutual understanding. He began to realize that their independence was not just a matter of stubbornness. It was the result of skill, knowledge, and a lifestyle that demanded self-reliance. For the first time, Samuel felt a true sense of admiration. These women were not objects or prizes. They were people who had built their own lives with strength and intelligence. As the sun climbed higher, Samuel considered his next step. He knew he could not approach them with money again. It had been rejected, and any repeat attempt would only confirm his misunderstanding. Instead, he thought, perhaps he could offer help in some practical way. He might assist with chores, carry water, or gather firewood, demonstrating that he was willing to contribute rather than demand. This plan, he hoped, would show respect and open the door for conversation. He approached cautiously, calling out softly, "I can help. I will carry water or gather wood if you allow it." The women paused, their heads turning toward him. Their eyes, calm and steady, measured him, reading his intentions. One of the women gestured for him to step closer but made no other motion. Samuel took this as a small sign of acceptance, though he remained wary of overstepping. For the rest of the morning, Samuel worked quietly under their supervision. He carried water from the stream, careful not to spill it, and gathered small branches for the fire. The women did not speak much, but they observed him closely, correcting his mistakes gently and without anger. Samuel began to feel a shift inside him. The power he had assumed he held through money was irrelevant here. What mattered was effort, patience, and a willingness to learn. Over the next few days, Samuel continued to visit the clearing. Slowly, a routine formed. Each morning, he would arrive with supplies or help in small ways. The women still did not show affection or friendship in the way he might have hoped, but they tolerated his presence and occasionally offered instructions or advice. Samuel found himself studying their movements, learning how they prepared food, crafted tools, and managed the small household. He discovered the complexity of their knowledge, the subtle techniques passed down through generations. One afternoon, as he helped arrange dried herbs in neat bundles, one of the women spoke to him more directly. "You work hard, but you do not understand us yet," she said. Her voice was calm but firm. Samuel nodded, feeling a mixture of humility and eagerness. "I want to understand," he replied. "I have much to learn." Her expression softened slightly, as if acknowledging his sincerity. She explained the importance of the plants they collected, how each had a purpose, some for healing, some for cooking, and some for rituals that honored their ancestors. Samuel listened intently, fascinated by the depth of knowledge he had never encountered. The women's connection to the land, to each other, and to their traditions was profound. It was a world far removed from the one he had known, yet he felt privileged to witness it. As days turned into a week, Samuel noticed subtle changes. The women began to acknowledge his efforts with small gestures, a nod, a quiet smile, or a simple word of encouragement. Though these signs were modest, they were meaningful to him. He realized that trust and respect were not immediate. They were earned through consistency, patience, and humility. One morning, as he helped carry firewood, Samuel finally asked a question he had been hesitant to voice. "Why do you stay here alone instead of joining a town?" he asked. The women paused, exchanging glances. Finally, one of them replied, "We value our freedom. We live as we choose without depending on others who may not understand us. The land is our home and we protect it." Samuel absorbed this answer, feeling a mixture of awe and shame. He had come with the idea that he could possess companionship through payment, and yet here was a community of strong, self-sufficient individuals who needed nothing from him. The lesson was becoming clearer. Respect for choice and independence was far more powerful than any offer of money or trade. As the sun set each evening, painting the sky in brilliant shades of red and gold, Samuel would sit quietly, reflecting on the day's events. He began to notice details he had overlooked before, the way the women moved with purpose, the subtle communication between them, the way they respected the land and each other. Each moment offered a lesson, a small insight into a life lived with intention and dignity. Samuel also reflected on his own past, recognizing the arrogance in his earlier assumptions. He had believed that money could buy relationships, that offers could replace understanding, and that possession was a valid measure of connection. Now he understood how limited that perspective had been. He was beginning to see the value of humility, patience, and true respect for others' autonomy. One day, while helping the women prepare a meal, Samuel noticed a group of travelers approaching the clearing. His heart raced. He feared they might disrupt the fragile peace he had begun to establish. As the travelers drew near, he realized they were merchants, carrying goods to trade with nearby settlements. The women welcomed them politely, negotiating trades for items they needed. Samuel watched in quiet admiration as they conducted themselves with confidence, clearly accustomed to dealing with outsiders. It struck him then that the women's independence was not isolation, it was strength. They knew the world, understood people, and maintained their dignity without needing to submit to anyone's expectations. Samuel felt both humbled and inspired. He realized that his journey was no longer simply about finding companionship. It was about understanding people, cultures, and the different ways life could be lived. As the week came to a close, Samuel recognized that his presence had shifted as well. He was no longer a man trying to acquire the women, but a learner, an observer, and someone seeking to respect and contribute. Each day offered a new lesson, and each interaction brought insight into a world far larger and more complex than he had imagined. The $6 he had once thought could secure a relationship now seemed trivial, almost laughable, compared to the knowledge and wisdom he was gaining. By the end of part 2, Samuel had transformed in subtle but meaningful ways. He understood that respect and trust could not be bought, that independence was a strength to admire rather than a challenge to overcome, and that his assumptions about people and relationships were often flawed. The women had not agreed to belong to him, and they never would, and in that refusal lay a profound lesson about human dignity and the value of freedom. As he rode back to his camp that evening, the sky painted with fading light, Samuel felt a growing sense of gratitude. He had come seeking something for himself, yet he was leaving each encounter richer in understanding. The frontier was full of lessons, and he realized that to navigate it successfully, he would need humility, patience, and an open heart. And though the women remained independent, proud, and unyielding, Samuel no longer saw this as a defeat. He saw it as an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to prepare for whatever challenges lay ahead. Days passed, and Samuel found himself increasingly drawn to the clearing. What had begun as curiosity had grown into a quiet determination, not to acquire anything or anyone, but to understand, to participate, and perhaps to earn a measure of trust. Yet, despite the progress he had made in observing and assisting the women, he still faced the undeniable reality. They were not interested in forming any sort of personal attachment to him. Their independence was complete, and any attempt to force it would only deepen his own frustration. That morning, Samuel woke before sunrise, the horizon tinged with soft oranges and purples. He packed a small bundle of bread and dried meat, and made his way quietly to the clearing, hoping to arrive before the women began their daily chores. As he approached, he saw them already active, one gathering herbs, another weaving strips of leather into a new basket, and the third tending the fire. Their movements were fluid and precise, showing years of practice and cooperation. Samuel paused for a moment, taking in the scene. He marveled at their skill, their independence, and the quiet order they maintained in their daily lives. With a deep breath, he called out softly, "Good morning. May I help you today?" There was no immediate response, just a subtle glance from one of the women. Samuel understood that this was not a greeting he would be met with, but rather an assessment. They were watching him as carefully as he had been watching them, judging his intentions and sincerity. Slowly, he began to carry water from the stream, careful not to spill a single drop. The woman tending the fire moved over to adjust the stones, silently guiding him without words. Samuel felt a small spark of satisfaction. It was not recognition, but at least they were allowing him to participate. As the day progressed, Samuel tried to learn more about their routines. He observed how they cooked meals over the fire, using careful timing and placement of stones to manage the heat. He watched them weave and create tools with materials gathered from the land. Each movement had a purpose, each task performed with attention and care. Samuel felt a growing respect for the women and a sense of humility. He realized that his assumptions, his idea that a simple offer could gain their acceptance, were completely misguided. The women's world operated on principles he had never considered: independence, skill, and mutual respect. Despite these lessons, Samuel's heart still held a quiet hope. He wanted some form of connection, some recognition beyond mere participation. He tried to engage the women in small conversation, asking about their day or commenting on the work they were doing. At first, the responses were curt, almost indifferent. But gradually, he noticed subtle changes: a nod, a quiet smile, a willingness to answer a question. These small gestures, though modest, felt monumental to Samuel. He realized that trust and respect were not immediate. They were earned through consistent effort and sincerity. One afternoon, Samuel attempted a new approach. He had spent the morning gathering extra firewood and herbs, arranging them neatly in baskets as an offering of help. When he arrived at the clearing, he set them down carefully and said, "I brought these for you. Perhaps they can make your work easier today." The women paused, exchanging glances. For a moment there was silence. Then one of them spoke softly, "We do not need gifts, but your effort is noted." It was not the acceptance he had hoped for, but it was acknowledgement, a small step forward. Encouraged, Samuel continued his efforts over the following days. He helped with chores, observed carefully, and asked questions when appropriate. Yet there was a limit to how far he could go. The women remained firm in their independence. They did not offer friendship, nor did they show any desire to change their way of life for him. This reality frustrated Samuel, but it also taught him an essential lesson. People could not be persuaded or bought when it came to matters of choice and freedom. One morning, while assisting with the preparation of a meal, Samuel's curiosity led him to ask a deeper question. "Why do you live this way? Why not join a town or family? You could have comfort and security there." The women paused, their expressions unreadable, Finally, the eldest spoke, her voice calm but filled with conviction. "Our strength is in our independence. We live by our choices, not by the expectations of others. The land provides for us and we protect it. That is our security." Samuel listened, realizing the wisdom in her words. He began to understand that freedom, self-reliance, and respect were far more valuable than any comfort he had imagined. As Samuel spent more time with the women, he began to notice other details. The way they communicated silently, with subtle gestures and eye contact. The way they planned tasks efficiently without needing to speak, and the quiet but unspoken respect they held for one another. These observations deepened his admiration and highlighted his own lack of understanding. He began to reflect on his life, recognizing that he had often sought control or possession rather than mutual respect. In their presence, he felt both humbled and inspired. Despite the growing understanding, Samuel could not ignore a sense of tension within himself. He wanted connection, recognition, and perhaps even approval, yet the women offered none of these on his terms. They were entirely their own people, and he had to accept that he could not impose his desires upon them. This internal struggle challenged him in ways he had never anticipated. It was not simply about physical tasks or daily routines. It was about confronting his assumptions, his ego, and his understanding of human relationships. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Samuel found himself sitting quietly near the clearing, reflecting on the day. The women were inside their small shelter, preparing the evening meal. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the long hours on horseback, the hope that a simple offer could secure companionship, and the slow, steady realization of the importance of respect and independence. It was a lesson he was still learning, and he knew that he had far to go. The next day, Samuel decided to try a different approach. Rather than seeking recognition or approval, he focused entirely on contribution. He carried water without being asked, prepared firewood in advance, and even began to notice small tasks that needed attention before anyone mentioned them. His goal was no longer to win favor, but to be genuinely helpful. This shift in perspective, he noticed, began to change the dynamic subtly. The women still did not offer friendship, but they allowed him closer to their daily routines, letting him participate without interference. Over time, Samuel began to notice moments of connection, though small and understated. A shared smile while arranging firewood, a quiet nod during a chore, a brief acknowledgement of his efforts. These moments, though subtle, were profound for him. They signaled that while the women maintained their independence, they recognized his sincerity and effort. Samuel realized that relationships, even in this context, were built on trust, respect, and consistency, not money or entitlement. One day, as he assisted in weaving a small basket, Samuel made a mistake, tangling the strips of leather. Frustrated, he looked up to see one of the women correcting him with calm patience. "Take your time," she said softly. "Attention matters more than speed." Samuel nodded, realizing that this was more than a correction. It was a lesson in focus, diligence, and mindfulness. He understood that the women's way of life was not merely practical. It was a philosophy, a system of values grounded in respect, care, and intentionality. Despite the progress, Samuel still grappled with his initial expectations. There were moments when he felt impatience or disappointment, longing for signs of connection beyond acknowledgement. Yet, with each day, he learned to temper these feelings, understanding that his desires were secondary to the women's autonomy. In this process, he grew not only in respect for them but also in understanding himself. He began to see the folly of attempting to control or possess, and the value of patience, observation, and humility. By the end of Part 3, Samuel had undergone a significant transformation. The initial goal of winning favor or connection had shifted into a genuine appreciation for the women's independence and skill. He had learned that effort, respect, and patience mattered far more than money or expectation. The women, while still firmly independent, had allowed him a place within their daily routines, not as a partner, not as a possession, but as a helper, a learner, and an observer. This realization brought him both humility and a quiet satisfaction. As he rode back to his camp that evening, the sky ablaze with sunset, Samuel felt a deep sense of reflection. The frontier was teaching him lessons that could not be bought, forced, or rushed. The women had shown him a world of independence, dignity, and wisdom, and he had begun to understand that connection was earned through respect, not demand. And though he still carried a quiet longing for companionship, it was tempered now with patience, understanding, and a growing admiration for those who lived life on their own terms. Days turned into weeks, and Samuel found himself returning to the clearing more often, not out of obligation, but from a genuine desire to learn and understand. The lessons he had absorbed over the past weeks were beginning to change him in ways he had never anticipated. His initial hope of acquiring companionship had shifted into something much deeper, a desire to connect with people on their own terms, to understand their lives, and to witness the world through their perspective. One morning, as he approached the clearing, the air was crisp and filled with the scent of dew on grass. The women were already at work, each engaged in their morning routines. Samuel paused at a distance, observing them silently. He noticed the ease with which they moved, the unspoken coordination between them, and the attention they paid to even the smallest details. It struck him how much of life, he realized, could be missed when one moved too quickly or without care. These women had mastered a rhythm of life that was deliberate, thoughtful, and precise. Samuel stepped forward and greeted them softly, "Good morning. May I help?" There was no immediate verbal response, but one of the women glanced at him, a subtle acknowledgement that he had been seen. He understood that trust and acceptance were not given freely. They were earned day by day through consistent effort. With that in mind, he set to work, gathering water, collecting firewood, and helping with the morning meal. Each task he performed was done with care, mindful of the lessons they had quietly taught him about patience and attention. Over the next few days, Samuel began to reflect more deeply on his own behavior and past assumptions. He remembered his initial belief that money could secure relationships, that offers could replace understanding, and that control was a valid measure of connection. Those beliefs had been challenged at every step. The women's refusal to conform to his expectations had been frustrating at first, but it had also been instructive. He now recognized that true connection required respect, patience, and empathy, qualities that he was only beginning to cultivate. One afternoon, as the sun climbed high in the sky, Samuel helped the women with gathering and preparing food. He observed the way they divided tasks, shared responsibilities, and communicated without words. Their efficiency was remarkable, but what impressed him most was their mutual respect. Each action was considerate, every decision collaborative. Samuel realized that independence did not mean isolation. It meant understanding, cooperation, and a profound sense of responsibility toward oneself and others. While helping, Samuel attempted to engage them in conversation, asking questions about their lives, their customs, and their understanding of the land. The women responded with careful, deliberate answers, offering insights into their daily routines, the plants they gathered, and the traditions they upheld. Samuel listened attentively, absorbing every detail. He began to see their world not as mysterious or alien, but as one of balance, skill, and wisdom. The clearing was more than just a place to live. It was a space of learning, growth, and deep connection to the land and to each other. Yet despite the progress, Samuel still faced moments of internal struggle. There were times when he felt impatience, wishing for signs of approval or connection beyond acknowledgement. He caught himself hoping that the women might finally accept him in a more personal way, forgetting the lessons they had quietly taught him. These feelings reminded him of the lingering traces of his old mindset, the desire to possess, to control, and to measure relationships through personal gain. But each time he reminded himself of their words, "We do not belong to anyone." It was a lesson in humility, one that he repeated quietly to himself as he worked. One day, as he helped weave a small basket, Samuel asked another question, this time about their independence. "Why do you choose to live this way, away from towns or families? Surely comfort and security could be found elsewhere." The women exchanged glances before the eldest replied, "Comfort is not freedom, security is not control. We live as we choose, and that is our strength. Our knowledge, our work, and our choices give us what we need." Samuel nodded thoughtfully. He understood that independence was not merely about living alone. It was about agency, dignity, and the ability to shape one's own life. This realization began to transform Samuel's perspective on his own life. He reflected on the ways he had previously sought to control outcomes, to manipulate circumstances, and to measure success through possession. The women's way of life demonstrated a philosophy he had never encountered: respect for oneself and others, mindfulness in every action, and a deep appreciation for the natural world. Each day he spent with them was not just an opportunity to assist, it was a lesson in values, character, and perspective. Over time, Samuel also noticed subtler forms of interaction. The women began to acknowledge his presence in small ways: a nod, a quiet smile, a brief word of encouragement. These gestures, though minor, were significant. They were signs that he was being recognized not as an intruder, but as someone who had shown consistent effort and respect. Samuel understood that trust and acceptance were not instant. They were built gradually, like the weaving of a basket or the careful tending of a fire. As the days passed, Samuel also began to reflect on the lessons beyond the clearing. He thought about the frontier, the towns he had passed, and the assumptions he had carried with him. He realized that much of life depended not on wealth, position, or power, but on understanding, respect, and empathy. The women had shown him that independence and dignity were not threats. They were qualities to admire, learn from, and incorporate into one's own life. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned shades of gold and violet, Samuel sat quietly near the clearing. The women were tending the fire, preparing a simple meal, and moving with a calm confidence that contrasted with his own earlier impatience. He thought about the journey that had brought him here: the initial misunderstanding, the frustration of rejection, and the slow, steady process of learning to contribute, observe, and respect. He realized that the most important lessons were not about achieving his own goals, but about understanding the values and choices of others. In this quiet reflection, Samuel recognized a profound shift within himself. He no longer approached the clearing with expectations or demands. Instead, he arrived with humility, curiosity, and a genuine desire to learn. The $6 he had once thought could secure companionship now seemed trivial and even foolish. What mattered was effort, respect, and understanding, the foundations of true connection, even if that connection was not what he had originally imagined. The women's independence remained unchallenged, yet Samuel found that his own perspective had changed. He began to see their refusal not as rejection, but as an opportunity to learn. They had allowed him into their world on their terms, teaching him lessons that extended far beyond daily tasks. He understood now that relationships, trust, and respect could not be purchased or forced. They were built through consistency, patience, and genuine effort. By the end of Part 4, Samuel had transformed significantly. He had moved from frustration and misunderstanding to admiration and humility. He recognized the value of independence, the strength of character, and the depth of knowledge that the women possessed. His journey was no longer about acquisition or control. It was about observation, learning, and self-reflection. And though the women remained fully independent, Samuel felt a quiet sense of accomplishment, not for what he had gained, but for what he had learned. As night fell over the clearing, Samuel prepared to leave, pausing to look back one last time. The women were inside their shelter, serene and unyielding, their presence a testament to resilience and dignity. Samuel realized that he had been given a rare gift, the opportunity to witness a life lived with intention, skill, and independence. He rode away under a sky full of stars, carrying with him the lessons of respect, patience, and humility, knowing that these lessons would shape not only his interactions with the women, but his entire approach to life moving forward. The days had grown shorter, and the air carried the crispness of early autumn. Samuel had spent weeks at the clearing, learning, observing, and gradually understanding the lives of the 3 Apache women. What had started as a journey, with expectations of control and possession, had transformed into a path of insight, humility, and respect. Each day had been a lesson, each interaction a reflection on patience, dignity, and the importance of choice. And now, as the final days of his stay approached, Samuel felt a mix of emotions, gratitude, awe, and a quiet melancholy. That morning, Samuel awoke before dawn, the soft light of day beginning to stretch across the plains. He prepared his small bundle of provisions, careful not to disturb the quiet of the land. As he approached the clearing, he observed the women already at work, their movements precise and graceful. One was gathering firewood, another arranging dried herbs, and the third carefully stirring a pot over the fire. Their routine, practiced and deliberate, spoke of discipline, cooperation, and mutual respect. Samuel paused for a moment, absorbing the scene, reflecting on how far he had come since his first, naive visit. Over the past weeks, Samuel had learned to act without expectation. He carried water, gathered wood, prepared meals, and assisted in small chores with care and attention. Every task was performed with mindfulness, as he had learned that respect was not shown through words alone, but through consistent, thoughtful actions. He had learned the rhythm of the clearing, the subtle cues of the women's communication, and the patterns of their daily life. Each lesson was a reminder of the depth and complexity of independence, and the value of working together without domination or control. Despite this understanding, Samuel still felt the weight of his initial assumptions. He had come with money in hand, believing that a few coins could secure companionship or influence. That belief had been challenged repeatedly, and each refusal, each silent assessment had humbled him. Yet the experience had not been wasted. Instead, it had reshaped his perspective. He now understood that respect, effort, and genuine engagement were far more meaningful than any transaction. As he worked alongside the women that morning, Samuel began to reflect on his own life beyond the clearing. He thought about the towns he had visited, the people he had met, and the relationships he had tried and failed to establish. He realized that many of his previous efforts had been guided by self-interest rather than understanding. He had sought control, security, and validation, but he had often overlooked the simplest and most essential truths, that every person has their own autonomy, their own choices, and their own dignity. By midday, Samuel had completed several tasks, gathering firewood, preparing a meal, and arranging tools for the women's work. He paused to catch his breath, sitting on a fallen log near the fire. The women moved around him, not ignoring him but not offering direct interaction either. Their presence was calm, assured, and unyielding. Samuel recognized in this quiet independence a profound lesson. Freedom and choice were not privileges to be granted, but rights to be respected. Feeling a need to express his appreciation, Samuel spoke softly. "I want to thank you for allowing me to learn from you. I came with expectations, with assumptions, and I now see how much I misunderstood. You have shown me patience, skill, and dignity, and I will not forget these lessons." The women glanced at him, their expressions calm but not unkind. There was no verbal acknowledgement beyond a brief nod, yet Samuel understood that this was a form of recognition in itself. They had allowed him into their world, not by yielding to his expectations, but by letting him observe, contribute, and learn on their terms. Over the next few hours, Samuel continued to assist where he could, but his approach had changed. He no longer sought approval or personal connection beyond what the women were willing to offer. Instead, he focused entirely on contribution and understanding. Each movement was intentional, each action thoughtful, reflecting his growing appreciation for their way of life. He had learned that true respect was demonstrated through effort, consistency, and humility, rather than through words or material offerings. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky with gold and crimson, Samuel decided to take a moment for reflection. He walked to the edge of the clearing and gazed out at the vast plains, the horizon stretching endlessly before him. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the long rides, the initial misunderstanding, and the gradual lessons in patience and respect. He realized that the $6 he had once considered so important was insignificant compared to the knowledge, insight, and personal growth he had gained. In the quiet of the evening, Samuel also reflected on the women themselves. He admired their independence, their skill, and the quiet strength that guided their lives. They had refused to conform to his expectations, yet they had allowed him to witness and participate in their world in ways that were both generous and instructive. Their presence had reshaped his understanding of relationships, respect, and the value of personal choice. Samuel realized that he had been given a rare gift, the opportunity to learn from people who lived with intention, wisdom, and dignity. That night, as he prepared to leave the clearing, Samuel packed his belongings with care. He approached the women one final time, setting down a small bundle of supplies he had prepared for them. "These are for you," he said softly. "Not as a payment, but as a gesture of gratitude. Thank you for allowing me to learn from you." The women acknowledged the gesture with quiet nods, their expressions calm and unyielding. There was no elaborate farewell, no show of emotion, yet the acknowledgement carried weight. Samuel understood that their way of showing acceptance was subtle, measured, and deeply meaningful. As he mounted his horse and began the ride back toward the horizon, Samuel felt a profound sense of reflection. The lessons of the past weeks would remain with him forever. He had learned that relationships could not be forced, that respect and trust were earned, and that independence was a strength to admire rather than a challenge to overcome. He had come seeking companionship, yet he was leaving with something far more valuable: wisdom, humility, and a deeper understanding of human dignity. Along the trail, Samuel thought about how these lessons could shape his life moving forward. He realized that he would approach people differently, listen more carefully, and respect the autonomy of others. The clearing, the women, and the lessons they imparted had left a lasting impression on him. He understood that human connection was not about possession or control, but about respect, patience, and shared understanding. By the time Samuel reached the edge of the plains, the stars were beginning to appear in the night sky. The vast expanse of the frontier stretched out before him, filled with possibilities, challenges, and opportunities for growth. He felt a quiet gratitude for the experiences he had gained, for the women who had taught him so much, and for the journey that had transformed his perspective. He understood that the world was larger, more complex, and more meaningful than he had previously imagined. As he rode into the night, Samuel felt a sense of closure. He would carry the lessons of the clearing with him for the rest of his life. The women had not agreed to belong to him, nor would they ever. And yet, through their refusal, they had given him something far more important than he had ever expected: insight, respect, and a profound understanding of what it meant to honor the choices of others. He rode on, the wind brushing against his face, the quiet of the night surrounding him. The frontier was vast, full of challenges, and filled with people whose lives could teach him countless lessons. Samuel knew that he would never forget the women, the clearing, or the lessons they had imparted. And in that knowledge, he found a sense of peace, understanding, and purpose that he had never known before. By the time he disappeared into the distance, the clearing remained behind him, serene and unchanged. The women continued their daily routines, independent and strong, a living testament to dignity, choice, and resilience. Samuel had come with expectations, with assumptions, and with a desire for possession. But he left with humility, wisdom, and a deeper appreciation for the strength and independence of those who live life on their own terms. The frontier stretched endlessly ahead, filled with possibilities, challenges, and lessons yet to be learned. Samuel rode forward with an open heart and a renewed mind, ready to face the world not as a man seeking to possess, but as a man seeking to understand, to respect, and to grow. And though the $6 he had once offered seemed trivial now, the lessons it had set in motion would last a lifetime, shaping him into a person capable of seeing the value in freedom, dignity, and true human connection.